This historic marker marks the locale of a place called Kinlock. It was owned by David Hubbard, who was a very important politician and attorney during the period in which the Byler Road was built, and he had a big hand in it. He also had a hand in the coming of the railroad from Decatur to Tuscumbia. He also was a state representative, maybe state senator. I don't recall exactly what his rank was, but nevertheless, he was important in the Alabama legislature during this time. Even during the time of the Civil War, which is some 40 years later after this road was built, he was active, and he had a place across the road from where we stand right now called his summer place. And that summer place was ultimately converted for use by the CCC camp, and that's in the 1930s. But before that happened, he was visited by Union Army here. Some 5,000 troops came through under General Upton and also General Wilson, who's the overall command of the Cavalry Corps. They came by here, stopped by here, and then went on about their way down to Falls City and Jasper from here. So that's back in the closing months of the Civil War. In March of 1865, the Union Army was here in force. I'd also mention that there was a battle in the first week of January of 1865. Colonel Palmer clashed with Confederate troops led by Colonel Russell, and they had an engagement here which involved a sword fight between the two colonels, and several men were killed. And there is a grave, a Union grave across the road that has 3 to 5 soldiers in it, or had them until they were recently reinterred by the federal government. Local observers indicate there were a group of about seven government vehicles here to effect that relocation of those bodies. So that occurred during the 1990s. So this is a historic place, very historic, and it dates back to well beyond Alabama even being considered a possibility. It goes back to the Paleo Indians and the Archaic Indians, which takes it back into 7,000, 9,000 years ago. This was an active place. According to local historians, in particular Butch Walker and other colleagues of his, have dubbed this to be the old Buffalo Trace, part of the Mobile Trace, but it dates back to Archaic and Paleo Indian days when there were herds of buffalo and elk and other animals that would feed on the grasses in the prairie belt of Alabama, now known as the Black Belt, and Mississippi, south central Mississippi and Alabama areas where the feeding places. And then when they got ready to get salt to sustain them over the winter, they would migrate up here into Tennessee, coming up the old Mobile Trace, then onto the old Buffalo Trace, it was called in Tennessee, to get to those salt licks of Tennessee and Kentucky. To your left here, this is the old sunken road for the original Byler that followed the ancient animal path known as Mobile Trace. The Byler Road was basically laid on top of the Mobile Trace route. And here it can be manifestly seen in its oldest form. So this is roughly an 1822 plus vintage road, although the buffalo had been using it for thousands of years prior to this road getting built. What we have here is a continuation of the Buffalo Trackway. It runs for a couple of 100 yards along this particular stretch, and the trackway is as deep as 15 feet deep, and that would be primarily from the hoofs of the buffalo and the elk and other herds that traverse this route, picking the mud up and basically moving it upstream or downstream depending on the distance they were walking. So this is a magnificent example of a sunken trailway believed to have been created by the woodland buffalo and by herds of elk that migrated from central Alabama, Mississippi up to the salt licks of Tennessee and Kentucky. Another importance of this place in American history is after the Louisiana Purchase in 1804 occurred, the U.S. government's governing office for what was called the Southwest Territories at the time, meaning the states of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, etc., was in a location down in Washington County, Alabama. And consequently, the communication with regard to all settlement of those Southwest Territories occurred with Washington calling the signals, but communication between the federal office in Nashville, Tennessee, and the office in St. Stephen's was very critical. And thus the old Mobile Trace was used as a Pony Express route to deliver messages back and forth between St. Stephen's and Nashville first, and then Nashville would relay onto the federal government in Washington. So in 1805, 6, 7, we had Pony Express riders, first in America, right here, operating out of Kinlock, and we have their names. So just be aware that this is very important in the early settlement of the North American continent and America's place in it.